Today on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast, I continue my interview with Professor Michael Jahosky, author of The Good News of the Return of the King, the Gospel in Middle-earth. And we'll get to all of that right after this. I've been using Coinbase.com and the Coinbase app for cryptocurrency for about 2 years now, which makes it really easy and safe to buy, sell, and store digital currency like Bitcoin and Ethereum. Sign up now and use my link at christiannerdsunite.com/Coinbase and get $10 of free Bitcoin when you buy or sell at least $100 worth of digital currency. Join 43 million other people who buy, sell, and manage their crypto on the world's most trusted crypto exchange. Check it out at christiannerdsunite.com/Coinbase. And now, back to the show. My interview with Michael Jahosky was so good that it ran over into a second episode. So today we continue our interview about his book, The Good News of the Return of the King, the Gospel in Middle-earth. Before we get back to the interview, let's read some scripture together. Let's read Revelation 21, 3-7. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." He said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Those who are victorious will inherit all of this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children." Most will say that The Lord of the Rings is not an allegory, and Michael basically says that it's not an intentional allegory, but that elements can be seen. I think this part of Revelation is a good parallel to one of Sam's most memorable quotes. Not an allegory, but a parallel. If you're not familiar with this quote, it's near the end of the Return of the King books, just after they awake, after they've dropped the ring into Mount Doom. Sam says, "Gandalf, I thought you were dead, but then I thought I was dead myself. Is everything sad going to come untrue? What's happened to the world?" "A great shadow has departed," said Gandalf. I think those two passages are a great parallel, showing that, God has returned, that evil has departed. As we'll talk in the interview today, many of these fantasy stories talk about good and evil, good versus evil, and can help communicate truth in a special way that can impact people, much the way Jesus used stories to impact people in the Gospels. I believe that storytelling is one of the most powerful tools we have in sharing the gospel. I want to challenge you to consider storytelling and how you can use it in sharing the gospel with unbelievers that you interact with on a daily basis. I would love to hear from you on how you take up that challenge. Now, let's get back to the interview. And I was actually looking for a quote, and I thought it was Tolkien, but I couldn't find it. And I thought it was on fairy stories, but I didn't have time to reread the whole essay. But doesn't Tolkien say something about, we tell these myths and these fairy stories in order to make the ideas that we're conveying in them even more real,
Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah.
something to that point. You know the
Yes.
quote I'm thinking
I
of,
do vaguely. Yes.
and
It's
it might
coming to
not be
me.
Tolkien that it may be somebody else, but
It
they
could have
talk
been
about
Lewis, maybe.
yeah, that's my other thing. I was
They're
thinking it
so,
could be
yeah.
Lewis,
Yeah.
but
Mm-hmm.
they said something about we tell these stories to communicate things that are even more real.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what myths do. I mean, that it looks at the unseen, which is more real because it's eternal. And of course, today in the modern framework, we tend to privilege empirical things as more real. But philosophy lurks behind the sciences. And that there are assumptions we go into doing science with, and so it already just there shows that the more real is that which we can't see, and it's very powerful. So getting into the topic of myth, which I also talk about a little bit in the introduction. That's another one of those really heavily laden words that just gets so badly misrepresented. But yes, I can't exactly where that is, but that notion is very Tolkien-esque, and Lewis, but both of them
Yeah.
would agree with that sentiment, that thought.
Well,
So
and let's talk a little bit about some of the characters in the Lord of the
yeah.
Rings. A lot of people, and I even did a podcast about it, with the idea of there are some Christ-like figures in the
Mhm.
Lord of the Rings. Now, my take on it is there is not one character who embodies Christ. There's no Aslan, which is a pretty blatantly the Jesus of Narnia.
Absolutely.
There's no Aslan in the Lord of the Rings, but there
Mhm.
are characters who convey some of the aspects of Christ.
Mhm.
Where do you see that in the Lord of the Rings? In which characters do
Sure.
you see? What do you see in them?
Yeah. Well, let me say that somewhere in my book, off the top of my head, I was just looking for it. I can't remember where, but I know I mention it, and I acknowledge the scholarship of many other fantastic scholars. I'm standing on their shoulders for this insight that it's a well-known fact that Tolkien did not put all of his Christian, or I'm sorry, Christ-like characteristics into one character.
Mhm.
I think again, this is a violation of what I say the art of the parable is in the book, borrowing from what Murray said. It's too heavy-handed. It's too obvious.
Right.
And there's some studies and research, and that Tolkien might have been influenced by the Beowulf author here for inspiration. Michael Drought, I
Mm.
believe, has written about this. So um, it's a well-known fact that Tolkien sort of split up the themes and the resonances with the Christian story, and the character traits of Christ, and more broadly the Christian themes across the story and across the peoples of Middle Earth. But
Mhm.
as you said, there are some that stand out more than others. And so,
Yes.
with that preface out of the way, let me say one more thing: is that I fully knowing that I tend to focus in my book, not tend to, I do focus on Aragorn,
Ah.
because the revelation that I got from N.T. Wright and many other biblical scholars in the last decade, that seeing the Christian story as the story of how God became king, not just about how Jesus was divine, but what that
Mhm.
means is that God is in charge of the world. He's reigning. He's putting everything right.
Mhm.
I when I heard that and I looked back on my Lord of the Rings experience, I had this just light bulb went off, and I thought that's what Lord of the Rings is about. And so
Mhm.
I got on this quest to write specifically about Aragorn, because also personally, as I say in the preface, this was tied up with my heart. So knowing that Aragorn is an obvious one, we can come back to him. But let's say, of course, Frodo is another quite obvious and probably main character, and Gandalf. And in many ways in which people would not, everybody talks about his fight with the Balrog, and their subterranean and then mountain climbing. In the book, it's just so much better.
Yes.
Um, I mean, the extended edition of the Two Towers gets some of it okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does, but and it's cool to see that. But yeah, there's some things there, obviously, with the resurrection, but it's also in Gandalf's role as a prophet, as an advisor, not as prophets aren't fortune tellers, but as a person that keeps the kings of Israel honest, that
Mm.
speaks on behalf of God, and sees the storyline, and sees God's fingerprints everywhere. Gandalf
Mhm.
has that and then also that Odin-like resonance too. So there's that other culture coming in. So I think you've got the three, and that corresponds to the three high offices of Christ as a king, prophet, and priest. I think from the letter to Hebrews in the New Testament. So yeah, those are the big three. But I'm sure, and I know that others have written about Sam and Merry and Pippin, Eowyn, that there are just so many examples of Christ throughout all of these characters, and we could talk about one or any of them. So,
Well,
or all of them, really.
you do focus on Aragorn.
Hmm.
So kind of walk me through some of the things you see in Aragorn that kind of represent Christ specifically.
Yeah, I was just trying to look for something exactly that I say here in chapter. For those of you that are interested in looking at the book, chapter 3 is where I really take off. I take a retrospective journey through Tolkien's books. We look at the Lord of the Rings in chapter 3, the Hobbit in chapter 4, some of the Silmarillion, and the debate of Finrod and Andreth, which is a part of the History of Middle Earth series in chapter 5. So some really nerdy stuff there, and that's a very difficult text, the debate, and it's really beautiful. But I think one of the things that really struck me when I first read it, and I was, in my journey studying, learning more about Jesus, was the discovery of the sapling towards the end, after Aragorn enters the city of Minas Tirith at the end of the Return of the King. And I think this precedes, I think it's the coronation, then the discovery, and then his marriage to Arwen. I might have them mixed up, but I talk about them in my book. And those three events, the coronation, the discovery of the sapling, which goes all the way back to Valinor, right, as a descendant of the tree, the two
Right.
trees. Um, and Gandalf's words about it, to keep it planted, reminded me, and I talk about this in chapters 2 and 3, of the already and not yet theme in the gospel. Is that that's the Christian story in a nutshell, is that Christ has to keep on reigning and put all enemies under his feet. We know he's won the great victory with his crucifixion and resurrection, but the story isn't finished. The already, the not yet. And I got that picked up with that conversation, that exchange that Gandalf and Aragorn have on the slopes of Mount Mindalluin, which is the mountain that Minas Tirith is built on. And it's a cool exchange. I think there's a lot there. Obviously, the revelation imagery and just the idea of Arwen and Aragorn coming together, uh, resonance with the unification of Christ and his church, and Christ and Israel, Israel being a bride being brought to the bridegroom. I explore some of those things. I talk about how through parable, it's not a one for one. It's not very allegorical with the paths of the dead, which is one of my favorite things that from the book. Um, you know, Again, it's not Aragorn doesn't die, but he
Right.
does in a sense. So you
Right.
might think, well, if it's an allegory, well, if it were more allegorical, and let's say maybe less parabolic or less metaphorical, then it would be he would have gone in, he would have died, and then he would have come out on the other side alive. And
Right.
then we'd say, oh, wow, that's like Gandalf, and oh, that's the resurrection. But that's not what happens. Um, Instead, I also talk about how that event reminds us of another often debated event in New Testament scholarship from the letter First Peter, I think chapter 3 and elsewhere in that letter. I'm a little rusty on exactly which chapter, but I know it's First Peter, about the harrowing of hell, the descent into Hades or Sheol. It's not quite hell; that's a whole other topic. But Christ preaching among the dead, and that I explore too. So again, a cluster of things I examine in chapter 3 uh, about Aragorn, and the challenge of the Palantir, where he reveals himself to Sauron in the book, and also in the extended edition. I think there's a scene, isn't there, where he grabs the Palantir,
Yes.
and is it the Return of the
He
King? I think.
reveals himself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's it's a great moment. And so I explore those and others that really just say Aragorn, Jesus,
Yeah.
but not in a way that hammers you on the head. It's
Right.
tantalizing. So
Yeah, I like the I like the idea that um if you're going to try to make it line up, if you're going to try to make Aragorn line up with Jesus, the outline is kind of, you know, in early on, he's rough and rugged, and Jesus is a
Mhm.
simple carpenter,
Mhm.
and at some point later he finally reveals himself, his glory, to
Mhm.
his disciples, and to you know so Aragorn reveals himself to his
Mhm.
companions, because they all stand in awe of him, going, he's never looked like this before.
That's right. Yeah.
Then you talked about the paths of the dead. If you
Mhm.
want to equate the paths of the dead to the crucifixion, which is, you're right, it's not exactly the same, but
Yeah, but it's a little bit.
when he comes out, he is kind of the king triumphant at that
That's
point.
right.
So
Exactly.
it is an interesting fit if you think through it that way.
Mhm.
Um, you know, was Tolkien thinking through all of those things when he wrote that? I don't
Mm.
know, or I don't know he has specifically wanted that to happen that way, or if he was just thinking about these kind of ideas, or they were just so steeped in who he was that they
Yeah.
couldn't help but come out.
That's what he basically alludes to, Ricky. Exactly. He says, "Look, I didn't write The Lord of the Rings consciously as a Catholic story." Although then he says elsewhere, "I've deliberately written a story." So Tolkien was weird. But to finish my sentence,
I've
it
read
quote,
some of that. I'm like, wait, you did or you didn't? I'm not
which
sure.
can
Depends
you
on which
clarify?
interview you listen to. No,
Exactly,
like
exactly.
every other author in the
You
world.
know, exactly right. I'm thinking of some modern fantasy authors. So, um,
Yeah, I know you're thinking of J.K. Rowling right now.
yes, yes, yes. So, oh man, that's another thing to give some thought to. So he says not consciously at first, but unconsciously Christian in the revision. And there's I just was recently on the Tolkien Road podcast with John Carswell, kind of helping him co-host, and we talked about this. That the debate of Finrod and Andreth was kind of a meditation on what he had written, and there are some that think from the History of the Middle Earth series that it's clear Tolkien, and according to his son Christopher, that he was trying to make everything kind of, oh yeah, this really is Christian. Well, let me make sure that really makes sense with that. And wow, I didn't realize how Christian it was. And so he really means that when he didn't consciously plan that. And I think because he didn't, that's why we don't get those one for one, like the past of the dead we were talking
Right.
about. And that's what I think, that's why it's great, because it respects the reader. It doesn't say you're gonna see this as Christian and you're gonna like
Right.
it. It's just there. It just seeps, out of his pores into the story naturally, which is brilliant. It's brilliant.
You said something right there that I think is important in all. This is something I have tried to convince people of in Christian media, whether it's writing, TV, movies, and I have been a bit of a filmmaker in the past, and
Oh,
I've had
cool.
this idea of, can Christians make good media that isn't doesn't have to be beat you over the head Christian?
Mm,
But you said it was natural.
mm,
And I think that is probably the most important part of something like The Lord of the Rings. If you come to it from a Christian perspective, you're going to see the Christian ideas flowing from it.
yep.
If you come at it from a secular viewpoint, you're still going to get the moral story,
Mm,
but you're not going to feel like you were beat over the head with a Bible.
exactly.
And I think that
Exactly.
is powerful, and I think it keeps the door open just enough for a believer to have a conversation with an unbeliever about, well, hey, I know you really liked this story.
Mm,
Have you ever experienced, have you ever read what the Bible says about stories like this? The kind of stories like
yes.
this.
And that's such an important part of evangelism slash apologetics, what some
Mhm.
people call pre-evangelism. And I agree with you
Yes.
100%. I think what that is, Ricky, is indirect communication, which there are so many great books. Mine talks about it, but not to the extent in a systematic way. If you're interested in this, folks, There's a book called Hide and Seek: The Sacred Art of Indirect Communication. Really good book. Another Whipton Stock author. They produce a lot of great books. This one's a jewel, though, and I'm not just saying that. It really, there's a lot of, people overlook the smaller pub. I mean, they're not small, but it's not Zondervan, so people think, oh, it can't be good. But yeah, it is. It's such a great topic, and you find that people are turned off by the heavy-handed Bible thumping approaches. Because why? And I've talked with some Christians, and they're saying, oh, well, they're not ready for the gospel. No, that's not it. Look to Jesus. This isn't, he got angry sometimes, yes, of course, but this was never his way. And I think if we miss the indirect communication aspect of how Jesus communicated the gospel, not only are we going to miss the forest through the trees with our communications, but we're also not preaching incarnationally, which I talk a lot about in the book too, that we've got to preach to the whole person and share with the whole person. They're not just mind, they're not just body, they're not just soul. They're a complex network of all, and so we have to keep that in mind. And so I think it's important to learn to speak and to think indirectly. And so that's a really great study. So I think people ought to really look into it more, especially if you are involved in ministry or just interested in talking with friends that are seekers and skeptics or unbelievers of varying kinds. So very important.
Absolutely. Well, tell me this real quick. Now I know that The Hobbit is a pretty easy read.
Yeah.
And for those who are listening, obviously we are focusing heavily on the books, although we kind of alluded to the movies a couple of times. Really, the kind of stuff we're talking about, I think you're going to get a better connection reading the books than seeing the movies. Some of it is in the movies, but I don't think it's as strongly a part of the films. But The Hobbit is a fairly easy read. The Lord of the Rings is a little more difficult read, plus its sheer volume. But the Debate and the Silmarillion are pretty heavy reading. Sell me on why somebody should take the time to read those particular volumes.
Well, I mean, I would say it's especially important if you're Christian, because you're going to find that Tolkien scholars like Brad Berzer, for example, who has written a book on Tolkien, say that the most theologically rich and incarnational and therefore Christian of probably all of these texts is the Debate, which is in volume 10, Morgoth's Ring of the History of Middle-earth, for those of you that are interested. And so that's an impetus and encouragement to read it. It's difficult, but actually I wouldn't say the Debate is all that difficult. If you read it slowly, it's actually not as dense as the Silmarillion, even though I think it was originally supposed to be part of it. So it's a fairly easy read. It's almost like reading Job, and some, like Berger, have described it as a Job-like dialogue. And that's exactly what it is. And because it's a dialogue, it's also more engaging to read. So I think it's more approachable. So now you know where to find it. And I reproduce in chapter 5. The Silmarillion, I find best is to read slowly and in parts. And I think you can hop around so long as you get yourself a good guide, and I know, for example, the Tolkien Road, they give out free guides to the Silmarillion. And so you understand the structure. And if you do, I would say start with the Ainul Indale, the creation myth, and read it carefully and prayerfully and slowly. It is very King James-like, English. So it's a difficult read, but it's theologically rich writing, and it really lays open, I think, if we look at the Christian story in the four acts, the creation and fall aspects are really heavily alluded to, and the redemption aspect is hinted at in the Debate. But read the Ainul Indale if you really want to see the creation of Tolkien's universe and understand the vision behind the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, and how the dwarves and the elves and men all interacted and came into being, and then also wrapping your mind around the plurality of divine beings, which is another interesting thing. The work of Mike Heiser has been really influential on my understanding, is that it isn't that Tolkien was thinking of the Trinity. He wasn't thinking polytheistically, but the Valar are God's divine counsel. You think of Psalm 82 and several hundreds of other verses in the Bible where God is surrounded with other divine beings that are part of his divine family, they're not equal to him. They're contingent beings, like we're contingent. Um, but you get all that, and I think, well, obviously Tolkien wasn't aware of Heiser's work. Heiser is just uncovering things that have been, seen before, but they're just becoming more popular again. I think Tolkien was aware of this henotheistic sort of layer to Jewish monotheism, and so I think you really get inside his mind. So I think it's important people read it. I'm trying to sell you on it as best as I can. The world is born into through music, and it's beautiful. So if you love the arts too, and you're a music person, you'll appreciate it. There's so many good reasons to read it.
Well, let me ask you this: in the Lord of the Rings, the trilogy,
Mm-hmm.
who is your favorite character? Who do you most connect with when you are reading the Lord of the Rings?
Ooh, I would say either Aragorn or Faramir. Um,
Mm.
Faramir is sensitive. He's transparent. He wears his heart on his sleeve, but he's thoroughly courageous and
Mm.
also a reflective person. And his familial issues, are something that a lot of sons could probably relate to,
Mm.
and people also daughters too in different ways. But so I think Faramir is one. And I think somebody, especially after I finished writing my book, I kind of realized I overlooked, and I don't talk about Faramir in my book, but it's something I've come to now as a fan returning to the text, kind of say, I
Mm.
missed this before. And so that's been fun. So I'm not tired. I'm not bored of the rings yet. I don't think I'll ever be. And then there's Aragorn, and that's how my journey got started. I not only wanted to be him, to be like him, but to be, to follow him, to be part of that fellowship, to have an important mission. And so I connected some of these yearnings that I have and still have in my own heart just sync up. Um, he's an example of great virtue and humility, and so it's an easy pick for me.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah,
a lot of I'm gonna put you on the spot. A lot
sure.
of people will gravitate to Sam as
Yeah.
being the the humble hero that.
Mhm.
How do you feel about Sam in the Lord of the Rings?
The movies kind of ruined Sam for me in some sense. I mean, he's not completely poorly depicted, I think, but I don't know. Sometimes I don't know if I have the right vocabulary for it off the top of my head, but there's a whininess sometimes about him that's present in the movies that's not in the book. So
Yes,
I don't
I
know
would
if other
agree.
people. Okay, maybe that's the word then. So yeah, I can see why people. I mean, in the book, he speaks in like a different dialect, and obviously a poorer, less educated dialect, and he's an everyman, and I think there's much to appreciate there. But it's another character I haven't really come around to looking at again until after I finished my book, and so usually during the autumn I reread the Lord of the Rings, and I've just started this September. Obviously, kind of lines up with the beginning of the book too, so I'm looking for new things, but just because I don't see it, I mean, plenty of other people have. So I can see why. He has a huge and influential part in completing the quest. I mean, but for many other reasons, I'm sure too.
When you're reading through, what's kind of your favorite part of the Lord of the Rings? When you're
Mm.
starting a read, what's the part that you go, this is the thing I want to get to as quickly as possible because I love reading this section?
Let me give you two. Okay. I mean, I have so many, but one is kind of a weird
Me too.
one.
Me too.
Yeah.
I'm with you. It's hard to
That's how
pick one.
yeah, that's how it should be. Um, so in both the beginning of The Hobbit, in the first chapter, and also I think in The Shadow of the Past, second chapter of The Fellowship of the Ring, it's Wanderlust. There are these comments that Tolkien makes, like after the dwarves finish singing. I just recently read this to my students too, and I could see it in their eyes that they seem to really be affected by it too. Where Bilbo was reminded of all the beautiful things in the world, and the narration that Tolkien does after the Misty Mountain song is concluded, and he thinks of waterfalls and mountains and carrying a sword instead of a walking stick. That wanderlust, really, I don't know, something about it. First of all, it makes me want to move out of Florida. uh, Second of all, and I've seen mountains and waterfalls, but I want to see them again. So it resonates with me. To the Lord of the Rings, you've got that Frodo likes to go walking in the autumn and bump into different travelers, and he always felt a restlessness during the fall, and so I always get excited when I read that because it's like reading me. It's like the book gets me, and I think it just it taps into something, and it just gets me excited about reading the books again. But then Tom Bombadil would be the other one, and
Yes.
I mean, I've just started getting into this lore again too. There's plenty written about him, but just mysterious is the word, and I want to know more. Um, the the food descriptions, the poetry, the singing, the way that the baths are described, just the way that the scenes are written, and the hospitality and warmth of Bombadil's house after going through the old forest, is great. I look forward to it. So
Awesome. So, Michael, you've got a great book. You didn't write it all that long ago, correct?
Last September came out.
Last September it came out. How long did it take you to write the book?
Ooh, I started penning the notes that would become chapters in 2012, but I officially
Wow.
started, heavy research and like sitting down to write because I had my first contract in 2015. I switched publishers after 4 years actually, because we had a disagreement of vision, especially with regards to the Christian vision of the book. So from 2015 to 2019, I was with McFarland Publishers, and then I moved to Whipfenstock in 2019. So really, to write it 5 years, solid writing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, so what's your next book?
Uh, I'm reading the Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. We just started, and it got me thinking. I know there are a lot of books about Harry Potter and Narnia,
Mhm.
but I want to do something probably with C.S. Lewis. What I'm considering, based on several advice of friends and reviewers of the book, that doing the treatment that I've done here, but now that I've kind of honed my craft to obviously shrink a lot of the fat that's in the first book, and I think I can accomplish what I accomplished in this book much quicker and more succinctly, and do it with Lewis. And one of the things that I'd like to show is, like I did in this book, how the art of the parable applies to what Lewis called supposals. He talked about supposals in his letters to people, which really reads like a description of parable. And so to basically give C.S. Lewis the good news of the Return of the King treatment, as I'll call it, but the gospel in Narnia, something like that. So I am kind of thinking down those lines. I have a good friend that I'm hopefully either he's going to co-author or he's going to be researching it with me and get some sort of credit. I don't know yet, but it's on the radar. I've got some things typed up, and then maybe something with J.K. Rowling after that, but I don't know. Definitely Lewis. So
Very cool. Well,
thanks.
in 5 years when you have it written,
Should be a lot
well,
less. My kids are grown up, a little bit older.
when
5
you
years.
have that,
Oh, God.
definitely going to have you back on the show to talk
Thank you.
about all these things at some point. And no doubt when you're ready for your next book, let me
Thank
know.
you.
I would love to have you back on the show to talk about your next book. But
It'd be my privilege.
when we're talking about Lord of the Rings, I'm definitely going to be giving you a call.
Please. I'm
Anything
ready.
else? Anything else you want to share before we go?
No, just that I'm very grateful to appear on your podcast, and I appreciate you taking the time to read as much of my book as you could. And before the interview, I know not everybody is able to do that, so thank you for taking the time to consider what I've written and to share your time and your podcast with me. Thank you.
Absolutely. And my plan is to finish your book
I
probably
know.
this weekend. It really is. I really have gotten fascinated. The
Thank you.
ideas that you're throwing out there that, especially the part about the allegory and
Yeah.
where he says it is, but then he
Mhm.
says he doesn't like that.
It's a lot of
I
back and forth. Yeah.
But, as we've discussed, Tolkien did kind of vacillate between ideas from time to time.
Yes, he did. So
And
just taking the
everybody
time to
just
read
talks
it, I
about the one
appreciate it.
time. So, yeah,
Oh, I know.
absolutely worth reading. If
Thank
you
you.
are interested in Michael's book, I will have links down in the show notes where you can get a copy of his book. And Michael, where can people connect with you?
Thanks, Ricky. www.mythicmission.com is my podcast slash second professor page. I have an official professor page with St. Petersburg College. If you just Google me, that'll come up. But that other website is a great way to stay in touch. I have a blog there, all of my interviews and things that I'm doing on my podcast. So everything is there. I'm on Facebook, Twitter. I'm not really so active on Instagram or LinkedIn, but my book has a page on Facebook as well. So I'm visible. I'm out there. I'm easy to find.
Awesome. Well, Michael, it has been a pleasure having you on the show today.
Pleasure has been mine. Thank you, Ricky.
It was great chatting with Michael. If you missed part one, make sure you go back to your podcast app and listen to last week's episode. And consider getting a copy of Michael's book, The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle-earth. And I'll put a link down below where you can order it. Well, that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, click all those links down below. And you can find all of our social links, our online store, and links to our YouTube channel at ChristianNerdsUnite.com. And while you're there, click on the support tab. We would love to have you as a Patreon. Before I go, I want to leave you with the same blessing I left you with last week. The blessing that Elrond gave Gandalf from the Fellowship of the Rings once again. Look not too far ahead, but go now with good hearts. Farewell, and may the blessings of elves and men and all free folk go with you. May the stars shine upon your faces. We'll see you next week. Blessings.